The wind came down from the peaks like a judgment, sharp enough to flay the warmth right out of a man's bones. It was a late autumn evening in the high country, the kind of day where the sun gave up early and left the sky bruised in shades of purple and iron gray, promising snow before morning. Elias Carr sat heavy in his saddle, his spine stiff from 12 hours of riding fence lines that seemed to stretch into eternity. Beneath him, his bay horse, a gelding named Banjo, blew a tired breath that plumed white in the freezing air, his hooves clattering against the loose slate of the steep trail. Elias did not spur the animal. He was a man who understood exhaustion, and he shared the horse's desire for the barn and a bucket of oats. He adjusted the collar of his sheepskin coat, pulling it tighter against his neck. The leather was worn smooth and cracked in places, much like Elias himself. He was 35 years old, though the sun and the wind had carved lines into his face that suggested he had seen half a century of hard winters. He had broad shoulders that carried the weight of the world without complaint, and eyes the color of flint that rarely missed a movement in the brush. As the cabin came into view, tucked against the lee of a granite ridge to shelter it from the worst of the northers, Elias pulled up on the reins. Banjo halted, his ears twitching. Elias narrowed his eyes. He lived alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, and he liked it that way. But the scene before him was wrong. It was a subtle wrongness, the kind a city man might miss, but to a man who lived by noticing the snap of a twig or the shift of the wind, it screamed of intrusion. A faint, pale thread of smoke leaked from the stone chimney. Elias had not lit a fire since before dawn. He shifted his gaze to the front door. The leather latch string, which he always left hanging straight down, was caught crooked in the jamb, and there, in the patch of mud near the threshold where the afternoon sun had briefly melted the frost, were footprints. They were small prints, the heel dragging slightly, too light to be a man's boot. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. He tied Banjo to the hitching rail, patting the horse's neck once for reassurance, then reached down and unhooked the leather thong over the hammer of his Colt revolver. He did not draw it yet, but his hand rested on the walnut grip, familiar and lethal. He moved toward the door, stepping carefully to avoid the creaky board on the porch. The wind howled through the pines, masking the sound of his approach. He reached out, lifted the latch, and shoved the door open, drawing the gun in one fluid motion. The warmth hit him first. The cabin, usually a meat locker until he got the stove going, was thick with heat. The smell of sage and salted beef filled the air. His heavy cast-iron pot was sitting on the hearth, the stew inside bubbling with a slow, rhythmic pop. But it was the sight of his bed that stopped him cold. A figure was curled up in the center of his mattress, buried deep under his heavy wool blankets. Only the top of a head was visible, a spill of dark. Tangled hair fanned out across the pillow where his own head usually rested. A pair of muddy and worn-out boots had been kicked off and lay in a heap on the floorboards. Elias stepped inside and kicked the door shut with his heel. The noise was like a gunshot in the small room. "Get up!" Elias barked, the barrel of the Colt leveled at the lump in the bed. The figure jerked violently. The blankets were thrown back, and a young woman scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough log wall. Her hand dove beneath the pillow and came up with a small, rusted paring knife he kept for skinning apples. She held it out with a shaking hand, her eyes wide and dark, filled with the terrifying brightness of a cornered animal. "Drop it," Elias said, his voice low and gravelly. He did not shout this time. He just tilted the barrel of the revolver slightly so the firelight caught the dull steel. The girl froze. She looked from the gun to his face, her chest heaving beneath a dress that was far too thin for the season. It was torn at the hem and stained with the red dust of the lower valleys. She saw the scar that cut through Elias's eyebrow, the cold set of his jaw, and the unwavering steadiness of his hand. The fight drained out of her shoulders. Her fingers opened, and the small knife clattered onto the floorboards. "I thought it was empty," she said, her voice cracking. It was a desperate, breathy sound. "I thought the place was abandoned." Elias kept the gun trained on her, though he lowered the hammer. Abandoned cabins do not have stocked woodsheds and glass in the windows. "Who are you?" She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her knuckles white as she gripped the wool. "I only meant to borrow the warmth. I was going to be gone by morning. I did not ask what you meant to do," Elias said, stepping closer. The floorboards groaned under his weight. "I asked who you are." She pressed her lips together, her eyes darting to the door and then back to him. She looked as if she expected a second man to burst in behind him. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara what?" Elias demanded. "Just Clara." Elias stared at her. She was young, perhaps 20, with a face that might have been pretty if it were not gaunt with exhaustion. There were dark circles bruised under her eyes, and a scratch ran angrily down her cheek. She looked like something the wind had blown in and broken against the rocks. But Elias Carr was not a man easily moved by pretty faces or sad stories. He had learned the hard way that trouble often came wrapped in soft packages. "Get out," he said. Clara blinked, as if she had not heard him right. "What? Get out of my bed, get out of my cabin! But it is freezing out there," she stammered, fear spiking in her voice again. "It is going to snow. I have nowhere to go." "That is not my concern," Elias said roughly. He holstered the gun, seeing she was no physical threat, and pointed to the door. "You broke into my home. You ate my food. You are lucky I did not shoot you through the blankets. Now move." She stared at him for a heartbeat, searching for some crack in his armor, some hint of mercy. Finding none, she swallowed hard, threw off the blanket, and swung her legs over the side of the bed. She stood up, swaying slightly on her feet. She did not reach for her boots. She simply walked barefoot toward the door, her chin held high in a fragile, trembling display of dignity. She opened the door, and the wind slammed into her. Elias watched as the gale caught her dress, whipping the fabric around her legs. She stepped out onto the porch, and he saw her body seize up as the cold bit into her skin. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since he arrived. It was bitter, deadly cold. He watched her take 2 steps into the mud. She wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders shaking so violently it looked painful. The light from the open door spilled onto her back, illuminating the sharpness of her shoulder blades and the raw, bloody skin on her knuckles where the cold had split the flesh. Elias stood by the fire, the warmth washing over him. He looked at the empty bed, then back at the girl shivering in the darkness. A memory flashed in his mind, not a thought, but a sensation, the weight of a shovel in his hands, the sound of dirt hitting a pine box, the face of a woman who had looked to him for help that he had not been able to give because he had been too slow, or too stubborn, or too late. He cursed under his breath, a sharp, violent word that was lost in the crackle of the fire. "Get back inside," he roared over the wind. Clara turned, her face pale, teeth chattering audibly. She looked at him with confusion, her eyes wide and watery. "I said get back in here before you freeze to death on my porch and I have to dig a hole for you in the morning," Elias yelled. She did not need to be told a third time. She scrambled back inside, stumbling over the threshold, and Elias slammed the door shut against the night, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The silence that followed was heavy and awkward. Elias marched across the room to a dark corner where he kept his storage. He dragged out a folded canvas cot, the hinges screeching in protest, and snapped it open near the hearth, but not too close to his own bed. He threw a spare, rough horse blanket onto it. "One night," Elias said, pointing a calloused finger at her. "You stay one night because I am not a murderer, but you sleep there, not in my bed." Clara nodded rapidly, rubbing her frozen arms. "Thank you, Thank you, and there are rules," Elias continued, his voice hard. "You do not touch my rifle. You do not touch my whiskey. And if I wake up and find you anywhere near my boots or my saddlebags, I will drag you down the mountain myself. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said softly. "Sit," Elias commanded, gesturing to the cot. She sat, pulling her legs up under her dress. Elias moved to the stove and stirred the stew she had made free with. He poured 2 bowls, grabbed 2 tin spoons, and handed one to her. He did not offer her a chair at the small table. He sat there himself, eating in silence, watching her from under the brim of his hat, which he had not bothered to remove. She ate like a starving wolf, quickly and without grace, scraping the bottom of the bowl until it was clean. When she was finished, she set the bowl on the floor and wrapped the horse blanket around her shoulders. The warmth of the food seemed to put a little color back into her cheeks. Outside, the wind died down, replaced by the soft, heavy silence of falling snow. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and turned his chair to face her. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows against the log walls. "You said your name is Clara," Elias said. He took a sip of the scalding coffee. "You did not give me a last name." She hesitated, picking at a loose thread on the blanket. "It does not matter. It matters if there is a posse looking for you," Elias said. "Or a husband." "I have no husband," she said quickly. Her voice was sharp, defensive. "Then who are you running from?" Elias asked. "A girl does not climb 5,000 feet into the mountains in a summer dress just for the view." Clara looked into the fire, the flames reflected in her dark eyes, making them look like pools of oil. "I ran from Red Hollow." Elias knew the town. It was a day's ride to the east, a cluster of buildings trying to call itself a city, built on cattle money and silver dust. "And my father," she said, the words coming out slow and heavy. "Samuel, he has debts. He is a man who likes to appear rich, even when his pockets are full of nothing but lint." Elias said nothing. He knew the type. The West was full of men who thought a silk vest made them a king. He made a deal. Clara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "To clear his books, to buy him more time and more credit. He sold me." "Sold you?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Arranged a marriage," she corrected, though the bitterness in her tone suggested there was no difference. "To a man twice my age, a man who has buried 2 wives already and treats his horses better than his staff." She looked up at Elias then, and he saw the steel beneath the fear. "I told my father no. I begged him. I told him I would work. I would scrub floors. I would do anything. He told me I was being selfish. He said it was my duty to save the family name." "So you ran," Elias said. "I waited until the house was asleep." Clara said, "I took nothing but what I was wearing because I was afraid the sound of a drawer opening would wake him. I climbed out the window." Elias looked at her hands. They were scratched and bloody. "How did you get here? That is 20 miles of rough country." Clara shuddered, pulling the blanket tighter. "I stayed off the road. I knew they would send riders along the main trail. I cut across the scrubland to the north." Elias frowned. "That is rattlesnake country." "I know," she said. "I heard them yesterday, when the sun was high. A stagecoach came by on the road below. I had to lie flat in the sagebrush. I was face to face with the dirt, smelling the dust, and I heard the dry rattle right next to my ear. I did not move. I laid there for an hour, terrified that if I twitched, I would die. And if I stood up, the men on the coach would see me and take me back." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I followed the dry creek bed up into the foothills. It was full of boulders. I slipped more times than I can count. I thought about turning back. When the sun went down, the air got so cold it felt like knives in my chest. I saw your chimney smoke just before the light failed. I thought if I could just get warm, I could figure out the rest." Elias leaned back in his chair. The story had the ring of truth to it. No one made up the detail about the rattlesnakes. He looked at her with a new measure of respect. She was foolish. Yes, but she had grit. "Who is the man?" Elias asked. "The one your father sold you to?" Clara flinched. She looked down at her hands. Garrison Holt. The name hit the room like a physical blow. The air seemed to get thinner, tighter. Elias felt the muscles in his jaw lock. His hand, resting on the table, curled slowly into a fist. "Holt," Elias repeated, his voice flat. "You know him?" Clara asked, looking up. Sensing the shift in his mood, Elias looked past her, into the dark corners of the cabin. "I know him." Garrison Holt was not just a rancher. He was a baron, a man who believed the barbed wire fences he strung up gave him the right to everything inside them, and half of what lay outside. He commanded a small army of hired hands who were little more than thugs with badges bought from a corrupt sheriff. 5 years ago, a friend of Elias's, a good man named Silas, who ran a small sheep operation in the valley, had refused to sell his water rights to Holt. 2 days later, Silas was found shot dead in a ditch. Holt's men claimed it was a dispute over a boundary line. The law called it self-defense. Elias called it murder. "I know him," Elias said again, his voice cold. "He is a man who takes what he wants. That is what my father said." Clara whispered. "He said Holt is a powerful man, that I should be honored." Elias looked at her. He saw the terror that the name invoked in her. He realized then that she was not just running from a bad marriage. She was running from a monster. And by letting her stay, even for a night, he had placed himself directly in the monster's path. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor. He walked to the window and looked out. The snow was falling harder now, a white curtain erasing the world. "Get some sleep," he said gruffly. Without turning around, Clara did not argue. She lay down on the cot, curling into a ball beneath the horse blanket. Elias blew out the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the orange glow of the dying fire. He sat on the edge of his own bed, pulling off his boots. He laid his gun belt on the crate beside him, the cold metal within easy reach. He lay back, staring up at the ceiling beams that were invisible in the dark. He listened to the wind moaning around the eaves, testing the chinking between the logs. Across the room, Clara tossed and turned. The cot creaked. He could hear her breathing, shallow, hitched breaths that caught in her throat. She was trying to cry silently. He realized. Elias closed his eyes, willing himself to ignore it. He had spent years building walls around his life, keeping the world and its miseries at a distance. He was a man who minded his own business. He fixed his own fences. He fought his own battles. But as he lay there, listening to the girl weep in the dark, he felt a crack forming in the stone he had placed over his heart. He thought of Garrison Holt, he thought of Silas, and he thought of the girl's raw knuckles and the way she had held that little knife, ready to fight a giant. Sleep came slowly to Elias, a restless, shallow drift. It was hours later, near the gray edge of dawn, when a sound jerked him from his slumber. "No, no, please!" It was a strangled cry, followed by the frantic scrambling of limbs. Elias's hand was on his gun before his eyes were fully open. He sat up, heart hammering. Clara was stumbling up from the cot, caught in the throes of a nightmare. She was disoriented, blind with panic. She moved across the small space between them, gasping for air. Before Elias could speak, before he could process what was happening, she was there. She crawled into his bed, scrambling over the edge of the mattress as if the floor were made of lava. She did not seem to know where she was, only that she needed to find something solid in the dark. She curled up beside him, pressing her back against his chest, clutching his heavy wool blanket in her fists. She was shaking violently, whimpering soft, incoherent words. Elias froze. For a long, charged moment, he did not move a muscle. He lay rigid, his hand still gripping the revolver on the crate, his breath caught in his lungs. She was right there. He could feel the heat of her body seeping through her thin dress, burning against his side. He could smell the scent of her hair, wood smoke and rain and something sweet, like dried flowers. Her hair spilled over his arm, soft and tangled. It was the most natural thing in the world, the way she fit into the hollow of the bed. It felt like a memory of a life he had never lived. The cold space inside him, the hollow ache he had carried for years without naming it, suddenly felt filled. A flicker of desire, sharp and hot, shot through him. It was an unwelcome guest, a dangerous spark in a room full of powder. He wanted to wrap his arm around her. He wanted to pull her closer and tell her that the monsters couldn't get her here. The thought terrified him more than the gun in his hand. He gritted his teeth, forcing the feeling down, locking it away in the dark. He was Elias Carr. He was a solitary man with a violent past and no future to offer a girl like this. He was not her savior. He was not her shelter. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with sleep and strain. She went still. She seemed to wake up then, realizing where she was. Her body tensed. Elias took his hand off the gun and placed it on her shoulder. He meant to be firm, to shove her away, but his touch came out gentler than he intended. He pushed her, just enough to create space between them. "This is not your bed," he muttered, the words sounding harsh in the quiet dawn. Clara scrambled back, her eyes wide as she looked at him over her shoulder. Her face was streaked with tears, soft and unguarded in the pale light filtering through the window. I am sorry. I was dreaming. I didn't know." "Go back to the cot," Elias said, turning his back to her, pulling the blanket up high to cover his shoulder. He heard her move. He heard the soft pad of her feet on the floorboards and the creak of the canvas cot as she settled back onto it. Elias stared at the log wall, his heart beating a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He told himself he would put her on a horse the minute the snow stopped. He told himself he would take her to the edge of the territory and leave her there. But as the wind picked up outside, whistling a lonely tune through the pines, a buried part of Elias Carr knew he was lying. He could still feel the phantom warmth of her against his chest, and he knew, with a sinking certainty, that he was not going to send her away. The dawn broke not with the golden promise of a new day, but with a hard, gray light that seemed to scrape against the frost-covered world. The storm that had threatened the previous evening had held off, leaving behind a silence so deep and brittle it felt as if a shout might shatter the sky. Elias Carr stood outside the cabin, his breath pluming in thick white clouds before his face. The cold was a physical thing, a heavy hand pressing down on his shoulders. He swung the axe with a grim, rhythmic violence, the steel biting deep into the seasoned pine logs. Thwack! Crack! The wood split clean, the scent of resin exploding into the freezing air. He had been out here since first light, driven from the cabin by the restless energy that had plagued him all night. Every swing of the axe was an argument he was having with himself. "Send her back," the rational part of his mind insisted. "Saddle the horses, ride down the mountain, and drop her at the sheriff's office in Red Hollow. Wash your hands of it." He split another log, the force of it jarring his elbows. But he knew the sheriff. Sheriff Miller was a man who owed his badge to Garrison Holt's influence. Returning Clara to the law was the same as delivering a lamb directly to the butcher's block. Elias paused, resting the head of the axe in the snow, leaning on the handle as he looked out over the ridge. The mountains rose up around him, rugged and unforgiving, peaks like jagged teeth biting into the underbelly of the clouds. He thought of the bruises he had seen on women before. Women who belonged to men like Holt. He thought of the way Clara had flinched when he raised his voice. He had spent a lifetime trying to outrun the ghost of a man he used to be, a man who solved problems with a gun. He had come up here to be alone, to let the silence scour him clean. But now, trouble had slept in his bed, and looking at the smoke curling from his own chimney, he felt a sick, churning weight in his gut. He could not send her back. Not to that. Elias gathered the armload of split wood, the bark rough against his gloves, and stomped the snow from his boots before kicking the door open. Inside, the cabin was warm, but the air was thick with tension. Clara was awake. She was kneeling by the hearth, feeding small sticks into the firebox of the stove. She had found the coffee tin and the water bucket. When Elias entered, she froze, her eyes darting to him with that same cornered animal look she had worn the night before. "Morning," Elias grunted, dumping the wood into the bin with a clatter. "Morning," she replied, her voice small. She stood up, wiping her hands on her dress. She looked exhausted. The circles under her eyes were dark bruises against her pale skin, and her hair was a tangled mess she had tried to finger comb into submission. But she was moving. She was trying to make herself useful, trying to prove she was not just a burden. Elias hung his coat on the peg and walked to the stove. The coffee was already boiling, the smell sharp and strong. He poured 2 tin cups and set them on the rough-hewn table. "Sit," he said. Clara sat. She wrapped her hands around the hot cup, wincing slightly as the heat touched her raw knuckles. Elias dished out 2 plates of beans from the pot that had been simmering since yesterday. It was a plain, joyless breakfast, but it was hot. He sat across from her, eating mechanically, watching her pick at the food. "We need to get something straight," Elias said, setting his spoon down with a clatter. Clara looked up, swallowing hard. "I have been thinking," Elias said. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "You have two choices, Clara, and neither of them is good." She waited, her gaze steady on his face. "Choice one," Elias said, holding up a finger. "You pack your things. I give you a horse and some supplies, and you ride west. You keep riding until you hit the coast or until you find a town big enough to get lost in." He watched her face fall. He continued, his voice devoid of pity. "But you should know what is out there, between here and the next territory. There is 100 miles of nothing but scrub, desert, and mountain passes that are already icing over. There are wolves, there are bears, and there are men drifting on the road who make Garrison Holt look like a choir boy. A woman alone, looking like you do. The odds are you do not make it 50 miles. Clara shivered, staring into her coffee cup. "And the second choice?" Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. "You stay here." Her head snapped up, hope flaring in her eyes. "You stay here," Elias repeated, his voice hard. "But not forever. Just until the snow melts or until I can figure out a way to get you out of this valley without Holt's men putting a bullet in both of us. But if you stay, you work, you earn your keep. This is a ranch, not a hotel. You do what I say, when I say it. You do not leave the cabin when I am gone unless the house is on fire. You stay off the skyline, and you never, ever tell anyone who you are if a stranger rides up." Clara nodded slowly. "I can work. I am not afraid of work." "You say that now," Elias said. "But looking at your hands, I would say the heaviest thing you have ever lifted is a silver teapot." Clara flushed, a flash of anger cutting through her fear. "I scrubbed floors in my father's house when the maids were sick. I know how to mend. I can cook, if there is food to cook." Elias looked at the beans on his plate. "Just do not burn the cabin down." "I will not," she said firmly. Then her voice dropped, trembling slightly. "But you should know. Holt will not stop looking. My father, he owes money, a lot of money. The marriage was the payment. If I am gone, the debt stands. They will be hunting me like a stray calf that ran from the herd. They will turn over every rock." "Let them look," Elias said, though a cold current of unease ran down his spine. "No one comes up here this late in the season. We are invisible." He stood up, finishing his coffee in one long swallow. "But if they do come, you let me do the talking. You hide. You do not make a sound. Do you understand?" "Yes," Clara said. "Thank you. Elias, do not thank me yet," he muttered, grabbing his hat. "You have not survived the winter." Days began to bleed into one another, forming a rough, heavy routine that settled over the cabin like the snow settling on the roof. The world outside shrank to the white expanse of the valley and the dark line of the timber. The wind was a constant companion, whistling through the chinking of the logs, rattling the shutters, a reminder that their sanctuary was fragile, held together by mud and timber against a vast, indifferent wilderness. Elias spent his days battling the elements. He chopped wood until his shoulders burned, building a stack against the north wall that grew higher with each passing afternoon. He hauled water from the creek, breaking the ice with a sledgehammer each morning, the water sloshing in the buckets, freezing on his pant legs before he could make it back to the porch. He checked his small herd of cattle in the ravine, pitching hay to the shivering beasts, counting them to make sure the coyotes or the cold hadn't taken one in the night. Clara kept her word. She worked with a quiet, desperate intensity. She swept the rough floorboards until the dust was gone. She took Elias's worn shirts, the elbows blown out and the collars frayed, and sat by the window in the gray afternoon light, stitching them with clumsy but determined fingers. She learned to cook with the meager supplies Elias had: flour, beans, salted pork, dried apples. The first biscuits she made were hard as rocks, and Elias had to soak them in his coffee to chew them. But he said nothing. The second batch was better. Her hands, soft and pale when she arrived, turned red and chapped. The cold water and the lye soap cracked her skin, but she did not complain. She wrapped strips of rag around her fingers and kept scrubbing. The cabin was small, a single room that forced them into an intimacy neither had asked for. They moved around each other like two planets in a tight orbit, careful not to collide. Elias caught her watching him sometimes. He would be oiling his saddle by the fire, or cleaning his rifle, and he would feel her eyes on him. One evening, he had rolled up his sleeves to wash in the basin, the firelight catching the faded, jagged scars that tracked up his forearms, souvenirs from knives and barbed wire in a life he tried to forget. He looked up and caught her staring. She did not look away immediately. Her gaze was curious, searching. "You walk quiet," Clara said softly. "Even inside, you move like you think someone is waiting behind the door." Elias dried his hands on a rough towel, rolling his sleeves down quickly. "Old habits. That is not a rancher's habit," she said. "That is a soldier's habit, or what?" Elias challenged, his voice low. She hesitated. "Or a man who has spent a long time looking over his shoulder." Elias threw the towel onto the table. "Everyone in this country looks over their shoulder. Clara, it is the only way to keep your head on your neck." He turned away, ending the conversation. But he could feel her eyes still boring into his back. She sensed it, the history he kept buried under the silence. She knew he was not just a man who raised cows in the middle of nowhere, but she did not press him. And for that, he was grateful. The weather turned a week later. It came not with a slow drift of snow, but with a violence that shook the ground. It was late afternoon when the light suddenly died. Elias was outside splitting kindling when the sky turned a bruised, sickly green. The wind, which had been blowing from the north, suddenly stopped, leaving a vacuum of silence that made the hair on his arms stand up. Then, a low roar began in the distance, sounding like a freight train barreling through the canyon. Elias dropped the axe. "Storm!" He ran for the cabin, shouting, "Clara, the shutters!" She was already moving. She had thrown open the door, her hair whipping around her face as the first gust hit, knocking the breath out of her. "Help me!" she cried, struggling with the heavy wooden shutter on the west window. Elias bounded onto the porch, grabbing the wood and slamming it shut against the casing, dropping the iron bar into place. The wind hit the cabin then, a physical blow that made the timbers groan. Hail, the size of marbles, began to hammer the roof, a deafening clatter that sounded like 1,000 gunfire rounds. "Inside!" Elias yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her back into the room. They fought the door shut together, the wind trying to rip it from its hinges. Elias threw his shoulder against the wood, his boots sliding on the floorboards. Clara pressed her weight alongside him, her small hands pushing against the rough planks. "Latch it," Elias grunted. Clara fumbled with the heavy bar, dropping it into the cradle just as a massive gust slammed against the outside. The door held. They stood there for a moment in the sudden gloom of the sealed cabin, chests heaving, adrenaline coursing through them. The sound of the hail was deafening, a roar that swallowed the world. The room was dark, lit only by the embers in the stove. Elias realized he was still holding her. His hand was gripped tight around her upper arm, and her shoulder was pressed against his chest. They were crowded into the small entryway, the smell of ozone and wet sage clinging to their clothes. He looked down, in the dim light. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated. She looked up at him, her lips parted, breathing hard. The air between them suddenly felt charged, thicker than the storm outside. A spark, hot and electric, jumped between them. It was the shared panic, the shared survival. Elias dropped his hand as if her skin had burned him. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "Get the lamp," he said, his voice rougher than necessary. Clara moved away, her movements shaky. She fumbled with the matchbox, striking a light and holding it to the wick of the kerosene lantern. The golden glow washed over the room, pushing back the shadows, but it did not dispel the tension. They were trapped. The storm raged for hours, the hail turning to a pounding, freezing rain that slashed at the roof. There was no going outside, No escaping the small, singular room. Elias added wood to the fire until it roared, chasing away the chill that seeped through the floor. They sat at the table, the noise of the storm making silence impossible, forcing them to speak just to hear something other than the wind. "My mother used to hide under the bed during storms," Clara said, staring at the flame in the lamp. She hated the thunder. She said it sounded like God was angry. "Your mother?" Elias asked. "She died when I was 12, Clara said quietly. That was when the house got quiet. "My father..." He stopped laughing after that. He started looking at everything like a ledger, even me. Elias watched the play of shadows on her face. He did not know how to comfort her, so he just listened. "When I told him I would not marry Holt," Clara said, her voice bitter. "He told me I was spoiled. He said I was a foolish girl who cried over a diamond because it was not cut the way she wanted. The whole town. I could hear them whispering when I went to the market. There goes Clara Holt, too proud for her own good. Does she not know how lucky she is?" She looked at Elias, her eyes wet. "Lucky. To be given to a man who looks at you like you are a brood mare." They did not care about that. They only cared that he was rich. "Money changes the way people see sin," Elias said quietly. "A poor man hits his wife. He is a brute. A rich man does it, and people say he is just firm." Clara nodded. "What about you, Elias? You talk about the world like you have seen the worst of it." Elias looked into the fire. The flames licked at the blackened iron of the stove. "I have seen enough." "You were not always a rancher," she said. "It was not a question." "No," Elias admitted. "I was not." He picked up a piece of firewood, turning it over in his hands, feeling the rough bark. "I grew up with nothing. No land, no family. When I was 18, I found out I had a talent for shooting straight. In this country, a man can sell that skill for a high price." Clara went still. "You were a hired gun?" "I was a regulator," Elias said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "That is what they called us. We worked for the cattle associations, keeping the peace, but mostly it was just pushing small men off land that big men wanted." He threw the wood into the fire. "I did things I am not proud of. Clara, I took money to scare good people. I told myself it was just a job, that if I did not do it, someone else would." "And then?" Clara asked softly. Elias's jaw tightened. The image of a burning homestead flashed in his mind. The scream of a woman he had promised to help. A promise he had failed to keep because he had been too slow on the draw, too arrogant. "Then I realized that blood does not wash off," he said, his voice tight. "And there was someone I was supposed to protect." He stopped. The memory was a physical pain, a sharp knife in his ribs. He could not tell her the rest. Not yet, maybe not ever. "I failed," he said abruptly. "So I came here, to be where there were no people to hurt." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "The storm is passing. We should try to sleep." The storm did pass, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and wet, but the thunder lingered, rolling over the hills in low, menacing growls that shook the ground. Elias lay on his bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was cold again. Across the room, on the cot, Clara tossed. He could hear the rustle of the horse blanket, the soft whimpers that had become the soundtrack of his nights. She was dreaming again. Suddenly, a crack of thunder, louder than the rest, split the night. It shook the cabin like a toy. Clara gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a sob. Elias sat up. "Clara?" She was sitting on the edge of his bed. She had moved so quietly he hadn't heard her. In the darkness, she was just a small, trembling shape. She was clutching her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice shaking so hard the words were barely formed. "I cannot stay over there. Please, he is in the room. I can feel his hands." She was talking about Holt. The nightmare had dragged the monster right into the cabin. Elias felt a fierce, protective surge rise in his chest, warring with the rigid code he lived by. He should send her back to the cot. He should light the lamp and sit in the chair until morning. It was improper. It was dangerous, but he heard her teeth chattering. He felt the terror radiating off her like heat. "Come here," Elias said, his voice rough. He lifted the heavy wool blanket. Clara did not hesitate. She scrambled into the bed, lying down on her side, facing away from him. She curled into a tight ball, her back pressed against his chest. Elias lay back down, pulling the blanket up over both of them. He lay stiff as a board, his arms at his sides, terrified to move. She was freezing. Her body was like a block of ice against him. But as the seconds ticked by, the warmth began to build. The heat of his body seeped into hers, and the heat of hers seeped into him. He could feel every breath she took. He could feel the tiny tremors in her shoulders as the panic slowly ebbed away, replaced by the heavy rhythm of sleep. Her hair tickled his chin, smelling of the rainstorm. It was torture. It was the sweetest, most agonizing torture Elias had ever known. He was a man who had gone years without a soft touch, without a kind word. And now, this woman, this brave, broken, beautiful woman, was in his arms, trusting him to keep the dark at bay. The hunger that rose in him was raw and terrifying. He wanted to pull her closer. He wanted to bury his face in her neck. He wanted to claim this moment, to claim her, to fight the world for her. His hand, resting on the mattress, moved without his permission. It brushed against her waist, feeling the curve of her hip through the thin fabric of her dress. Clara sighed in her sleep, a soft, contented sound, and shifted closer, pressing her back firmly against him. Elias froze. His fingers lingered on her waist for a heartbeat. 1 second, 2 seconds, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing. It would be so easy. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw clenching until his teeth ached. No, he was not Holt. He was not a man who took advantage of fear. He was not a man who stole what wasn't freely given. He forced his hand away, resting it back on the mattress, his fingers curling into a fist. He lay there in the dark, listening to the thunder fade into the distance, guarding her sleep while he waged a war against his own lonely heart. Morning came with a pale, gray light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving the air crisp and cold. Elias woke slowly. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was or why the bed felt so crowded. He was warm, warmer than he had been in years. He opened his eyes. Clara was still asleep. Sometime in the night, they had shifted. His arm was draped over her waist now, holding her close. Her hand was resting on his forearm. Her fingers curled loosely around his wrist as if anchoring herself to him. Their legs were tangled together beneath the wool blanket. Elias lay there, staring at the back of her head. The silence in the room was absolute, but it wasn't the lonely silence of before. It was a charged, heavy silence. He should move. He should pull away before she woke up. But he didn't. He lay there for another minute, stealing the peace, letting himself pretend that this was his life. Then, Clara stirred. She took a deep breath, stretched, and turned her head. Her eyes opened. She looked at the arm draped over her, then up at his face. Elias pulled his arm back quickly, shifting away to the edge of the bed. The cold air rushed into the space between them. "Morning," he croaked, his voice thick with sleep. Clara sat up, pushing her hair out of her face. Her cheeks flushed a sudden, bright pink. She looked down at the bed, then at him. The awkwardness was palpable, a physical weight in the room. "Morning," she whispered. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, but she didn't look terrified. She didn't look like she wanted to run. She looked at him, and a small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was tentative, barely there, but it transformed her face. It was the look of someone who had woken up without a nightmare for the first time in months. "Thank you," she said softly. For the dark." Elias looked at her, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw the trust in her eyes. He saw the safety she felt with him. And he knew, with a terrifying clarity, that he was in trouble. He could not stay detached. He could not pretend she was just a stranger passing through. Whether he liked it or not, whether it was wise or not, he cared what happened to her. He would kill for her. I will get the fire started, Elias said, swinging his legs out of bed and grabbing his boots, moving fast to hide the shaking in his hands. He walked to the stove, his back to her, but he could still feel her smile warming the cold air between them. The bottom of the flour sack was a dusting of white powder, barely enough to coat a biscuit, and the coffee tin rattled with the hollow sound of emptiness. It had been 3 weeks since Clara had stumbled into the cabin, and the mountain winter, though beautiful in its savage way, had an appetite that did not negotiate. Elias stood by the pantry's shelf, staring at the meager supplies. He turned the coffee tin over in his hand. "We are out," he said flatly. Clara looked up from the table where she was mending a tear in one of his old shirts. "Out of coffee, out of everything," Elias corrected. "Flour, coffee, salt, and I'm down to my last box of cartridges for the rifle. If a wolf gets into the herd, I will be throwing rocks at it." He set the tin down with a definitive clank. "I have to go to Red Hollow." The needle froze in Clara's hand. She looked at him, her face draining of color. "You cannot go there. I have to. Clara, we cannot eat snow, but they will see you," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Holt's men are everywhere. If they see you buying supplies for 2, if someone asks about me, I know how to keep my mouth shut," Elias said, his tone sharper than he intended. He was already angry at the empty shelves, angry at the danger, angry that he had to care about any of this. "It is too dangerous," Clara insisted. Standing up, the shirt fell to the floor. "Please, Elias, we can hunt. We can ration what is left. Do not go down there. And what happens when the next blizzard hits and we are boiling leather for soup?" Elias snapped. He turned on her, his own fear masking itself as frustration. "The mountains do not soften just because you are scared. Clara, hunger kills faster than Holt does." Clara flinched as if he had slapped her, but she held her ground, her chin lifting. "I am not scared for me. I am scared for you. If they find out you are hiding me, then let them find out," Elias roared. He slammed his hand against the rough log wall. "I am tired of hiding in my own home like a criminal. I have to go." He saw the tears spring to her eyes, and the anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving him feeling hollow and ashamed. He hated this feeling, the vulnerability of having something to lose. For years, he had ridden the line between life and death with a careless shrug. Now, the thought of leaving her alone, or of being taken from her, terrified him. He took a breath, running a hand over his face. "I cannot leave you here alone. Clara, if I go, and they come up here while I'm gone." He looked at her, at the dark hair she had tried to braid, at the delicate curve of her jaw. An idea formed in his mind, reckless, stupid, and possibly their only chance. "You are coming with me." Clara stared at him. "Are you mad? That is walking right into the lion's den. Not if they do not know it is you," Elias said. He walked to the trunk at the foot of his bed and threw it open, digging through the layers of wool and canvas. He pulled out an old, heavy canvas coat, stained with oil and dirt, and a wide-brimmed felt hat that had lost its shape years ago. "Put these on," he said, tossing them to her. "Tuck your hair up. Rub some soot on your face. You are not Clara Holt, the runaway bride. You are my cousin's kid, a mute boy who helps with the horses. You keep your head down. You keep your hat pulled low. We ride in. We buy what we need, and we ride out. We do not stop for anyone." Clara looked at the dirty coat, then at Elias. "It is madness. It is survival," Elias said. The ride down the mountain was a descent into a harder world. The air grew thicker, heavier with the dust of the plains. They rode in silence, the only sound the crunch of hooves on loose rock and the creak of saddle leather. Clara rode Banjo, while Elias took the roan pack horse he used for hauling. The canvas coat swallowed her small frame, and with the hat pulled low over her eyes, she looked like a scrawny, nondescript ranch hand. But beneath the disguise, Elias could see her knuckles white on the reins. They crossed dry arroyos where the earth was cracked like old pottery. They passed skeletal cottonwoods standing guard over a narrow, trickling creek, their branches reaching up like bone fingers scratching at the sky. The open plain stretched out before them, endless and exposed. A sea of sagebrush and brown grass under a relentless, pale blue sky. Elias kept his eyes scanning the horizon. He rode with his right hand resting on his thigh, inches from his gun. Every swirl of dust in the distance, every shadow of a hawk, made his muscles tense. As Red Hollow came into view, Elias felt his stomach tighten. It was a huddle of wooden buildings clinging to the dust, dominated by the white steeple of the church and, on the hill overlooking it all, the imposing brick house of Garrison Holt. It looked like a fortress, staring down at the town with dark, judging windows. "Keep close," Elias murmured as they hit the main road. "Do not look anyone in the eye." They rode past the livery stable, the smell of manure and hot iron heavy in the air. A few men were lounging on the boardwalk, smoking pipes. They glanced at the two riders, but their eyes slid over Clara without interest. Just another rancher and his hired help. Elias guided them toward the general store. He dismounted and tied the roan to the rail. Clara slid down from Banjo. Her movements stiff from the long ride, she kept her head down, studying the tips of her boots. Elias stepped up onto the boardwalk, his boots thudding hollowly on the wood. He stopped, nailed to the wall of the store. Next to the door was a notice board. It was cluttered with advertisements for patent medicine, cattle auctions, and bounties. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. There, weathered by sun and rain but still legible, was a sketch of a face he knew too well. His own. It was an old poster, from 3 years ago, issued in a county 200 miles south, wanted for questioning in the death of William Red Miller. It claimed he was armed and dangerous. It blamed him for a gunfight that had left a ranch hand dead. A fight Elias had not started, but one he had finished. But that was not what made his breath catch. Right beside it, crisp and white, was a fresh notice. Missing. It read in bold, black block letters, Clara Holt. Beneath the headline was a description. Daughter of respectable businessman Samuel Holt, 5 feet 4 inches, dark hair, dark eyes, last seen wearing a blue silk dress. Subject is unstable and prone to wandering. A generous reward is offered for her safe return or information leading to her whereabouts. Elias heard a sharp intake of breath beside him. Clara was staring at the poster, her eyes wide beneath the brim of the hat. "Unstable," she whispered, the word trembling in the air. She read the rest of the text, her jaw tightening, prone to wandering, like a lost dog, like a child who does not know her own mind. Elias saw the shame flush her cheeks, visible even through the soot she had rubbed there. He saw the anger flare in her eyes. They had stripped her of her reason, her agency. To them, she was not a woman fleeing abuse. She was a broken thing that needed to be collected and put back on a shelf. 2 women walked past them, glancing at the poster. "Poor Samuel," one of them murmured, adjusting her shawl. "To have a daughter like that. I heard she was always a bit wild. Ungrateful is what she is." The other sniffed, walking away from a man like Mr. Holt. "Some girls do not know when they have been blessed." Clara made a small, choked sound. Elias stepped between her and the women, shielding her with his broad back. He took her elbow, his grip firm but gentle. "Inside," he said, his voice low and hard. "Now." He steered her into the store. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that felt jarringly out of place. The interior smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. Elias moved to the counter, keeping Clara behind him near a display of shovels. The shopkeeper, a balding man with spectacles, looked up. "Help you?" Elias pulled a list from his pocket. "Flour, 50 pounds. Coffee, beans, salt pork, and a box of .45 cartridges." The shopkeeper nodded, turning to gather the items. Elias leaned against the counter, trying to look casual, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched the door. He watched the window. Clara drifted away from him, moving down the aisle toward the dry goods. She kept her head down, pretending to examine a bolt of calico cloth. She felt exposed, as if the canvas coat were made of glass. Every time the floorboards creaked, she flinched. Near the back of the store, 2 men were leaning against a cracker barrel, chewing tobacco. They were rough-looking sorts, cattle hands by the look of their chaps. "I heard Holt is tearing the county apart," one of them said, spitting into a brass cuspidor. "He has got riders going as far as the pass. He is not looking for the girl." The other man laughed. "He is looking for his pride. You cannot have a filly run off the night before the branding and not look like a fool." They laughed, a low, ugly sound. "What about that drifter?" the first man asked. "The one Holt had the run-in with a few years back." "Carr?" "Carr?" the second man scoffed. "That drunk. He is long dead, or hiding in the hills like a coyote, eating lizards. Holt said the man trespassed on his land and threatened his crew. Said he was crazy. If he is still alive, he is probably half-starved and freezing to death in some hole." Elias stood at the counter, his hands gripping the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. He could hear every word. Drunk, crazy, coyote. It was the same old story. The rich men wrote the history, and the poor men lived the lie. Holt had painted him as a villain to cover his own crimes, and the town had swallowed it whole. Fury, hot and blinding, simmered in Elias's chest. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to walk back there and smash his fist into the man's face. He wanted to scream the truth until the windows rattled. "Sir," the shopkeeper said, "that will be $4. Elias didn't answer. He was staring at the 2 men, his breath coming fast. Suddenly, a small hand touched his arm. Elias looked down. It was Clara. She had come up beside him, her hat pulled low, but he could see her eyes. They were pleading. "Cousin," she mumbled, pitching her voice low and rough. "The horses are restless." "We should load up." She squeezed his arm. It was a warning. "Don't do it. Don't throw it all away for pride." Elias looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a fierce protectiveness. She was stepping in to save him from himself. He let out a long, ragged breath. He unclenched his fists. He dug into his pocket and slapped the coins onto the counter. "Keep the change," he growled. He grabbed the sack of flour, hoisting it onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. Clara grabbed the coffee and the ammunition. They walked out of the store, heads down, leaving the lies behind them. Outside, the air felt cooler, but the anger inside Elias was still boiling. He marched around the side of the building, into the narrow alley that ran behind the store. It was shaded there, smelling of dust, horse manure, and old garbage. He dropped the flour sack onto a crate and spun around, pacing the small space. "Did you hear them?" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "Did you hear what they said?" Clara set the supplies down on the dirt. "Elias, please! They are just talking! They are lying!" Elias shouted, though he kept his voice to a harsh whisper. "Holt takes everything. He takes the land, he takes the water, and then he takes a man's name. He turns me into a drunk and a trespasser, so no one asks why his men shot my friend in the back. He kicked the dirt, sending a cloud of dust into the air. And you, unstable, prone to wandering. He makes you sound like a child who lost her way. He is erasing you. Clara, he is rewriting you so that when he drags you back, no one will lift a finger to help you because they will think he is doing you a favor." Clara stood there, watching him. She had never seen him like this, so raw, so unguarded. The stoic rancher was gone, replaced by a man burning with a sense of injustice that had been festering for years. "It is not just about the name, is it?" she asked softly. Elias stopped pacing. He looked at her, his chest heaving. Clara took a step toward him. She took off the hat, letting her hair fall loose around her face. The soot on her cheeks made her look wild. "Desperate. I ran," she said, her voice steady now. "Not just because of the marriage, not just because he is old and cruel." She took another step. "I ran because 3 nights before the wedding, he came to the house. My father was out. The servants were gone. He cornered me in the study." Elias went still. The air in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. "He told me he wanted to make sure I understood my place." Clara whispered. "He backed me against the desk. He put his hand on my throat." She touched her neck, her fingers tracing a memory of pain. He dug his fingers into my jaw. He told me that after the wedding, I would learn obedience. He said he would break me like a horse, and I would thank him for it. She looked up at Elias, tears standing in her eyes but refusing to fall. That is why I ran, Elias. Not because I was spoiled, but because I knew if I stayed, I would die. Maybe not my body, but everything inside me would be dead. Elias stared at her. The rage that had been hot and chaotic a moment ago coalesced into something cold and deadly. It was a white-hot point of focus. He looked at the bruise on her spirit, the invisible marks Holt had left on her. He wanted to kill him. He wanted to walk up that hill, kick down the door of the brick house, and tear Garrison Holt apart with his bare hands. He reached out. He did not think about it. It was instinct. His hand cupped the side of her face. His thumb, rough and calloused, grazed her jawline, tracing the spot where she said Holt had hurt her. It was a touch of reverence, of apology for a world that allowed such things to happen. I would burn this whole town to the ground before I let him touch you again, Elias said, his voice a low rumble. Clara looked at him, her breath hitching. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes. She felt the roughness of his skin, the strength in his fingers, and for the first time in her life, a man's touch did not feel like a claim. It felt like a shelter. She opened her eyes. They were dark and vast, filled with a sudden, terrifying clarity. Elias. She breathed. They moved at the same time. There was no decision, no hesitation. The gap between them vanished. Elias bent his head, and Clara rose on her toes. Their lips met. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce. It tasted of dust and desperation, of fear and fury. It was the collision of two people who had been pushed to the edge of the world and found only each other hanging on. Clara clung to the front of his shirt, her fingers twisting into the fabric, pulling him closer. Elias's arm went around her waist, pulling her flush against him, lifting her slightly off the ground. He deepened the kiss, a groan vibrating in his chest. He wanted to consume her, to protect her, to hide her inside his own skin where no one could ever hurt her again. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. There was no Holt, no wanted posters, no cold mountain waiting for them. There was only the heat of her mouth, the press of her body, and the fire that had been smoldering between them since the night she broke into his cabin. Then, a sound shattered the moment. A wagon clattered loudly on the street, just around the corner of the alley. A man shouted at a mule. Elias and Clara broke apart as if they had been scalded. They stood there, chests heaving, staring at each other. Clara's lips were swollen, her eyes wide with shock. Elias looked like a man who had just woken up from a fever dream to find himself standing on a precipice. They were in town, in broad daylight. Anyone could have turned that corner. Anyone could have seen them. Elias wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes darting to the alley entrance. "We have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." Clara nodded, unable to speak. She jammed the hat back onto her head, tucking her hair away with trembling fingers. She grabbed the coffee tin. Elias hoisted the flour. They walked back to the horses, keeping a careful distance between them, but the air around them crackled with electricity. Every glance was charged. Every accidental brush of their sleeves felt like a lightning strike. They mounted up and rode out of Red Hollow without looking back. They rode hard, pushing the horses until the town was just a speck in the distance, until the brick house on the hill was swallowed by the haze. But as they climbed the trail back into the safety of the mountains, watching dusk bleed purple and red over the horizon, neither of them spoke. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the silence of friends. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of two people who had crossed a line and knew there was no going back. Elias looked at Clara's back as she rode ahead of him. He knew the danger had just doubled. If Holt found them now, if Samuel Holt discovered who his daughter was with, they wouldn't just be hunted, they would be destroyed. And yet, as he touched his own lips, tasting the ghost of her on his skin, Elias Carr could not bring himself to wish it hadn't happened. He would face the fire. He decided, He would face the fire for one more minute of that feeling. Winter did not just arrive, it conquered. It swept down from the high peaks with the weight of an iron hammer, burying the world in silence and white. The snow piled high against the log walls of the cabin, drifting up to the windowsills until the light inside took on a permanent, muffled gray quality. The path to town, once a difficult trail of rutted dirt and loose shale, vanished entirely, erased by 4 feet of powder and ice. The world shrank. It contracted until it consisted only of the 4 walls of the cabin, the radius of the heat from the cast-iron stove, and the 2 people trapped inside it. Time lost its rigid shape. Days blurred into nights and back into days, marked only by the consumption of wood and the level of oil in the lamp. In this enforced confinement, Elias and Clara moved around each other like clockwork mechanisms, learning the rhythm of the other's existence. Elias learned that Clara hummed when she was concentrating. It was a low, unconscious sound, a melody from some hymn or parlor song she must have heard in her father's house. She did it while she sat by the fire, mending the tears in his spare canvas coat, her brow furrowed in the dim light. The sound, initially strange to ears accustomed to solitude, became a comfort to him, a signal that he was not alone in the void. Clara learned that Elias never slept without checking the window first. Every night, after banking the fire, he would stand by the shutter, peering through the crack into the blackness, his hand resting on the frame. She noticed, too, that even in sleep, his right hand drifted toward the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall by the bed. He was a man who rested but never truly relaxed, his body a coiled spring waiting for a threat he was sure would come. The cabin was small. There was no escaping the physical reality of each other. They brushed shoulders passing between the table and the hearth. Their fingers brushed when Elias handed her a bowl of stew or when she passed him a cup of coffee. In the biting cold of the pre-dawn hours, when the fire burned low and the frost crept across the floorboards, the boundaries of propriety dissolved into the necessity of survival. They shared the bed not out of scandal, but because the cold was a predator that sought to kill them both. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a static that had nothing to do with the winter storms. It was a thick, suffocating tension, born of proximity and the memory of that kiss in the alley behind the general store. They did not speak of it, but it hung between them, unspoken and undeniable. One evening, the wind howled with a particular ferocity, shaking the roof and driving the temperature down until the nailheads in the door frosted over white on the inside. Elias had spent the afternoon fighting the drifts to chop wood, battling the gale that tried to freeze the sweat on his skin. He came in stomping the snow from his boots, carrying an armload of frozen pine. He dropped the wood into the bin with a crash and stood by the door, shivering violently. His face was gray with cold, his hands stiff and clumsy as he tried to unbutton his heavy sheepskin coat. His fingers fumbled, unable to work the latches. "Let me," Clara said. She was there before he could protest, her hands pushing his aside. She worked the buttons quickly, her fingers deft and warm. She helped him shrug out of the heavy coat, hanging it on the peg where it dripped melting snow onto the floor. "Sit," she commanded gently, pulling the chair closer to the stove. Elias sank into the chair, too exhausted to argue. He held his hands out toward the iron belly of the stove, his fingers pale and waxy. Clara knelt beside him. She took his hands in hers. Her skin was rougher than it had been when she arrived, chapped from work and water, but compared to his frozen flesh, she felt like silk and fire. She began to rub his hands, chafing the circulation back into them, her thumbs working over his knuckles, her palms pressing heat into his cold skin. Elias watched her. The firelight danced in her dark hair, casting shadows across her cheekbones. He felt the blood returning to his fingers, a painful prickling that was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. Clara kept rubbing, her head bowed. Then, slowly, her movement slowed. She did not let go. Her thumbs traced the ridge of a scar on the back of his hand, a gentle, lingering touch that sent a jolt straight to his spine. She looked up. Her eyes were dark, wide, and searching. She did not pull away. The silence in the room stretched, tight as a bowstring. The wind screamed outside, but in here, the only sound was the pop of the fire and the ragged intake of Elias's breath. "Elias," she whispered. The sound of his name broke the dam. Elias surged up from the chair, pulling her up with him. He did not think. He did not weigh the consequences. He cupped her face in his large, rough hands, tilting her head back, and brought his mouth down on hers. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a collision of weeks of silence, of fear, of cold, and of a hunger that had been gnawing at them both. He kissed her deeply, desperately, tasting the coffee on her tongue and the life in her breath. He backed her gently until her shoulders hit the rough logs of the wall. He pressed his body against hers, the hard planes of his chest flattening her soft curves, trapping her there. Clara did not fight him. She made a low sound in her throat and clutched at his shirt, her fists bunching the fabric, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her. They were trembling, both of them. It was a fever that had nothing to do with the sickness of the season. Elias pulled back an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his breath coming in harsh rasps. His eyes burned with a dark, intense light. He looked at her as if he wanted to devour her and save her all at once. "Clara," he groaned, his voice rough with restraint. "I am tired." "Elias," she whispered, her voice fierce and breathless. "I am tired of being told who owns me. I am tired of men deciding what my body is for." She reached up, her fingers threading into the hair at the nape of his neck. "They say I am ruined. They say I am shameful. I am tired of feeling like shame itself." She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "I want to choose. For once in my life. I want to choose. I want to feel something good, something real, not forced, not filthy. I want you." The words hit Elias like physical blows. He felt a surge of desire so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. Every instinct in his blood screamed at him to take her, to claim the comfort she was offering, to bury himself in her warmth and forget the cold world outside. But then he saw the vulnerability in the set of her jaw. He thought of Garrison Holt's hands on her throat. He thought of the way men in this country treated women, as property, as currency, as things to be used and discarded. Elias stiffened. He pulled back slightly, his hands still framing her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I am not him," Elias said, his voice grating like stone on stone. "I will not be another man who takes from you just because you are desperate." "I am not desperate," Clara argued, her voice breaking. "I am certain. You are scared," Elias corrected gently. "And you are hurt, and we are alone in the dark." He closed his eyes for a second, fighting the demon of his own want. "If I touch you, Clara, if we do this, it has to be because you are free, not because you are running." He opened his eyes. They were sad, solemn, and filled with a love that terrified him. "I will not take more than you understand you are giving." Clara stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. She saw the restraint costing him, the tremor in his hands as he held himself back. In his refusal, she saw a respect she had never known existed. She leaned forward and kissed him again, soft and slow. "Then hold me," she whispered. "Just hold me." The heat in the room shifted. The frantic, clawing desperation melted into something slower, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. They moved to the bed. They did not undress. Elias lay down on his back, fully clothed, and Clara lay beside him, fitting her body against his side. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him. They lay there in the firelight, whispering questions into the dark. She asked him about the first horse he ever rode. He asked her about the books she used to read in her father's library. They touched each other with a reverence that bordered on worship, his hand stroking her hair, her fingers tracing the buttons of his shirt. They kissed for hours, long, lingering kisses that tasted of salt and longing. They skirted the edge of the precipice, looking down into the depths of what they could be, but neither pushed the other over. It was a night of vulnerable honesty, of admitting that they wanted each other, and proving that love could be patient even when the world was ending. The end of their peace came before the sun. The world was still trapped in the blue-black ink of pre-dawn when the sound cut through the silence. It was a crunching noise, rhythmic, heavy. Elias woke instantly. He did not drift awake. He snapped into consciousness, his hand already closing around the cold steel of the Winchester rifle. He lay still for 1 second, listening. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, breaking through the crust of the snow. Elias was out of bed in a fluid motion, moving silently in his stocking feet. He signaled Clara to stay down with a sharp, chopping motion of his hand. He crept to the window and peered through the crack in the shutter. The snow reflected the starlight, illuminating the yard with a ghostly glow. 4 riders were approaching the cabin. They were black silhouettes against the white drifts, their horses breathing steam that swirled in the freezing air. They moved with the arrogance of men who knew they had the law, or money, on their side. Elias recognized the lead horse immediately, a tall roan with a distinctive gait. It belonged to the foreman of the Holt Ranch. "Get up," Elias hissed, turning back to the room. Clara was sitting up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Who is it?" "Holt's men," Elias said, his voice low and calm, though his pulse was racing. "And one I do not know. Maybe one of Samuel's hired hands." Panic flared in Clara's eyes. She scrambled out of bed, looking around the room as if the walls might open up and swallow her. "What do we do?" Elias grabbed her arm, steering her toward the corner of the room where the storage barrels stood. He kicked the small rug aside, revealing a loose floorboard. He pried it up with his fingers, revealing a dark, cramped crawl space dug into the earth beneath the cabin. It was used for keeping root vegetables from freezing, smelling of damp earth and potatoes. "Get in," Elias ordered. Clara looked at the dark hole, then at him. "Elias." "Get in, Clara, now!" She lowered herself into the darkness, curling her legs up to fit in the shallow space. She looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the shadows. "Do not make a sound," Elias whispered, leaning close. "No matter what they say, no matter what you hear, you stay quiet. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Be careful." Elias dropped the board back into place. He smoothed the rug over it and dragged a heavy wooden chair on top of the rug, positioning it naturally. He had just enough time to pull on his boots and throw a log into the stove before the heavy fist pounded on the door. "Bang, bang, bang! Open up!" a voice bellowed. Elias grabbed his coat, shrugging it on to cover his gun belt, though he left the coat unbuttoned for easy access. He rumpled his hair, trying to look like a man roused from deep sleep. He walked to the door and threw the latch. Pulling it open, cold air rushed in, along with the smell of horse sweat and tobacco. 4 men sat on their horses just beyond the porch. The lead man, a scarred brute named Vance, who worked for Holt, leaned forward on his saddle horn. Beside him was a man Elias did not recognize, a sharp-faced fellow in a city coat who looked like he belonged in a bank ledger. Not a saddle. "Morning," Elias said, squinting against the cold. "You boys are a long way from a warm fire," Vance sneered, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the pristine snow. "We are looking for something, car or someone." Elias leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "I haven't seen any stray cattle up this high. Wolves got the last ones. We ain't looking for cows," the city man said. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it up. It was the poster. "The one from the general store. We are looking for a girl," the man said. "Clara Holt. Ran off from her father. Flighty little thing. Not right in the head. Doesn't understand what is good for." Elias looked at the poster, keeping his face blank. "A girl? Up here, in this weather. She would be a popsicle by now." "That is what we figured," Vance said, his eyes scanning the interior of the cabin over Elias's shoulder. "But tracks are funny things. Sometimes they disappear, sometimes they lead to places they shouldn't. I haven't seen a soul in 3 weeks." Elias lied smoothly. "Just me and the wind." Vance chuckled. A low, dry sound. Is that right? Just you? A lonely man like you? Carr, I would think you would welcome the company. Even a crazy girl. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped into the snow. The other 3 men followed suit. Mind if we warm up? Vance asked, not waiting for an answer. He pushed past Elias, shouldering his way into the cabin. Elias pivoted, his hand hovering near his waist. You got a warrant, Vance. I got a search party, Vance said, kicking the snow off his boots onto Elias's clean floor. And I got a suspicion. The men crowded into the small room. They seemed to fill it, sucking up the air. They looked around with hungry, predatory eyes. The city man walked to the table, running a finger over the rim of the coffee cup Elias had left there. 2 cups, the man noted. Elias didn't flinch. I get thirsty. Vance walked to the bed. He looked at the tossed blankets. He looked at the Winchester leaning against the wall. Then he turned to Elias, a nasty grin spreading across his face. You know, Carr, Vance said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. I saw another poster in town the other day, right next to the girls. Had a face on it that looked a hell of a lot like yours. Elias went still. Some county down south still has a price on your head. Vance continued. Not a big one, but enough to buy a round of drinks. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If they couldn't find the girl, maybe they would take him instead. Just for the sport of it. I settled my debts, Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. Maybe, Vance said. Maybe not. One of the other men, a lanky hand with a wandering eye, was poking around the shelves. He knocked a tin of beans to the floor. Then he stopped. Well, look at this, the lanky man said. He reached out and picked something up from the small side table near the window. It was the sewing basket. A small, woven basket filled with thread and needles. Elias cursed silently. He had forgotten to hide it. You take up needlepoint. Carr, the lanky man asked, holding the basket up. Or maybe you got yourself a little house pet you ain't telling us about. Suspicion flared into certainty. The mood in the room snapped from tense to violent in a heartbeat. She is here, the city man said, his voice sharp. Search the place. Tear it apart. Hey, Elias shouted, stepping forward. Get out of my house. Vance shoved Elias back. Hard. Sit down. Carr, unless you want to bleed. The men began to ransack the cabin. They kicked the cot over, sending the canvas flying. They threw the blankets off the bed. They pulled the supplies off the shelves, dumping flour onto the floor in a white cloud. Elias stood with his back to the stove, his eyes darting between the men. He was calculating the odds. 4 against 1. In close quarters, it was suicide, but he couldn't let them find the trap door. The lanky man was moving toward the corner, toward the storage barrels, toward the chair and the rug. Maybe she is hiding in the root cellar, the man said, grinning. Like a rat. He reached for the chair to pull it away. Elias snapped. The calm rancher vanished. The regulator returned. No! Elias roared. He launched himself across the room. He hit the lanky man with the force of a battering ram, slamming him into the log wall. The man grunted, the air leaving his lungs in a whoosh. Elias drove a fist into the man's gut, then an elbow to his jaw. Bone crunched. Hold him, Vance shouted. The other 3 men swarmed him. Elias fought with the desperation of a man protecting his whole world. He ducked a swinging fist and landed a solid right cross on the city man's nose, shattering it. Blood sprayed. He kicked Vance in the knee, sending him stumbling, but there were too many of them. A heavy boot kicked Elias in the ribs. He gasped, stumbling back. Rough hands grabbed his arms, pinning them behind his back. Vance scrambled up, his face twisted in rage. He drew his revolver. You son of a bitch, Vance spat. Gunfire exploded in the small room. Bang! The shot went wild, burying itself in the ceiling beam. Splintering wood raining down. But the noise was deafening. Get him outside, Vance screamed. Drag him out! They hauled Elias toward the door. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but they had him. They dragged him over the threshold and threw him into the snow. Elias tried to rise, but a boot caught him in the jaw. His head snapped back. The world spun. Vance stood over him, breathing hard. He holstered his gun and looked at the cabin. "She is in there somewhere," Vance said. "If she won't come out, we will smoke her out." "No!" Elias gasped, spitting blood into the snow. "Don't!" Vance grabbed a kerosene lantern from his saddlebag. He smashed it against the side of the cabin, the glass shattering, the oil soaking the dry logs. He struck a match and flicked it. The flame caught instantly. It roared up the side of the wall, licking at the eaves. "Burn it," Vance ordered. Elias watched in horror as the fire took hold. The wood, seasoned and dry, caught like tinder. Smoke began to billow, black and thick, rising into the crisp blue sky. Inside the cabin, underneath the floorboards, Clara lay in the dark. She heard the fight. She heard the shot. She heard the sickening sound of the boot hitting flesh. And now, she heard the crackle. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. The heat was already seeping down through the wood. Smoke began to drift through the cracks. She was trapped. If she stayed, she burned. If she came out, they took her. Outside, the men mounted their horses. "Let the mountain finish him," Vance said, looking down at Elias, who was lying half-conscious in the red-stained snow. "And if the girl is in there, well, ashes tell no tales." They laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed off the ridge. They turned their horses and rode off, leaving the destruction behind them. Elias lay motionless. He could feel the heat on his face. He could hear the roar of the fire consuming the only home he had built. He tried to move, to crawl toward the door, but his body refused to obey. Darkness clawed at the edges of his vision. "Clara," he whispered, the name lost in the sound of the flames. The sound of hooves faded into the cold distance, swallowed by the wind, leaving behind only the voracious roar of the fire. Clara coughed, her lungs burning with the acrid taste of pine smoke. She was curled in the darkness of the crawl space, the damp earth pressing against her back. But the heat above was becoming unbearable. The heavy rug Elias had placed over the trap door was smoldering, the edges curling into orange ash. She pushed upward. The chair that had been dragged over the rug had been knocked askew during the ransacking, but the weight of the floorboards was still immense. She shoved with her shoulders, gritting her teeth against a scream of effort. The wood groaned and gave way, flipping back with a crash of sparks. Clara clawed her way out of the hole, scrambling over the hot floor. The cabin was a furnace. The roof had partially collapsed near the stove, sending a shower of burning beams onto the cot where she had slept. The heat seared her face, drying the tears on her cheeks instantly. "Elias!" she screamed, but the sound was lost in the crackle of the flames. She threw herself toward the door, shielding her face with her arm. The cold air outside hit her like a physical blow, shocking her lungs. She stumbled off the porch and fell into the snow, gasping for breath. The yard was lit by the hellish glow of the burning cabin. Shadows danced wildly against the tree line, and there, 10 feet from the porch, lay a dark shape in the snow. Clara scrambled on her hands and knees toward him. Elias was sprawled on his back, his arms thrown out as if he had been crucified on the ice. His face was a mask of blood where the boot had caught him, and his skin was terrifyingly pale against the snow. "Elias!" Clara cried, grabbing his shoulders. He did not move. His breathing was shallow, a ragged rattle in his chest. Clara looked back at the cabin. The heat was intense, melting the snow in a widening circle around the structure. If she left him here, the fire might not reach him, but the cold surely would. And if the roof fully collapsed, the sparks could set his coat alight. She had to move him. She grabbed him under the arms, digging her heels into the slush. He was heavy, far heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She pulled, her boots slipping on the ice. She gritted her teeth, a primal sound of exertion tearing from her throat. "Move," she hissed at herself. "Move!" She dragged him inch by agonizing inch away from the inferno, toward the darkness of the trees. Her thin dress offered no protection against the biting wind that whipped around the corner of the burning building. Cinders stung her neck and hands like angry hornets. 50 yards away, a shelf of granite jutted out from the hillside. forming a shallow, three-sided cave protected by a screen of juniper. It was not much, but it was out of the wind. Clara collapsed as she dragged him under the overhang. Her lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. She checked Elias again. He was shivering now, violent tremors that shook his whole frame. The snow was melting on his swollen cheekbones, mixing with the blood. She had one blanket, the horse blanket Elias had thrown over her the first night. She had grabbed it from the floor in her scramble to escape the fire. Clutching it by instinct, she shook it out, wrapping it tightly around him, tucking the edges under his body. It was not enough. Clara looked at the dying fire of the cabin, then at the freezing man. She lay down in the snow beside him, inside the blanket, pressing the full length of her body against his. She wrapped her arms around his chest, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat, trying to transfer every ounce of her own heat into him. "Stay with me," she whispered into the dark. "Do not you dare leave me here alone." Snowflakes began to drift down, quiet and indifferent, settling on the blanket and on Elias's eyelashes. Time lost its meaning in the dark. It was measured only by the slow, painful return of sensation to Elias's body. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and shifted. Clara jerked awake. She had drifted into a half-sleep, exhausted and numb. Elias. He opened one eye. It was swollen shut on the left side, but the right eye focused on her, glassy and confused. He tried to sit up, but a spasm of pain doubled him over. He coughed, spitting red into the snow. "The cabin," he rasped, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "Gone," Clara said softly. "It is gone. Elias." He closed his eye, his head falling back against the rock. I told you I was nothing but trouble." "Hush," Clara said, tightening her grip on him. "You have to go," he muttered, trying to push her away with a weak hand. The movement was pathetic, lacking any of his usual strength. "Take the horse. If Banjo is not spooked, take him. Ride west. I am not going anywhere," Clara said firmly. "Listen to me, girl," he snapped, though the anger was thin and brittle. "I am done. My ribs are cracked. I can barely see straight. If they come back, if they find you here with me, they will not find me because we are leaving," Clara interrupted. "Together." "No," Elias groaned. "I am a dead weight. You have a chance, Clara, a chance at a life without men coming after you, without fire, without blood. Go!" Clara grabbed his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her fingers were freezing, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, terrifying light. "Do you think I ran from one prison just to walk into a life of loneliness?" she whispered furiously. "Do you think I care about being safe if it means leaving you to die in the snow?" She leaned closer, her forehead pressing against his. "I would rather die beside you, Elias Carr, than go back to a world where I am owned. I would rather freeze on this mountain holding your hand than sit in a warm parlor with a man who hates me." Elias stared at her. He saw the steel in her spine, the iron in her soul that he had sensed from the beginning. He tried to speak, to argue, but the words died in his throat. He reached up, his hand trembling, and covered hers on his cheek. "You are a stubborn woman. Clara Holt," he whispered. "I learned from the best," she replied, her voice breaking. Dawn arrived as a pale, sickly bruise on the horizon. The light revealed the full extent of the devastation. The cabin was a smoldering ruin of black timbers and gray ash. A single pillar of smoke rose straight up into the still morning air, a beacon that could be seen for miles. Clara stared at the smoke. Her stomach dropped. "If they look back," she said, her voice tight, "if Holt's men look back and see the smoke, they will know. They will know the snow did not put it out. They will wonder if we survived." Elias struggled to sit up, clutching his side. "They will send someone to check, or they will spread the word in town that I am dead. Either way, we cannot stay here. We need a doctor," Clara said, looking at the blood on his coat. "You are hurt bad." "Elias, I have had worse," he lied, gritting his teeth as he shifted his leg. "We are going to town," Clara decided. "To Red Hollow?" Elias looked at her as if she were mad. That is the mouth of the wolf. Clara, it is the only place with a doctor, she countered. And it is the last place they will look for us. They think we are running west or dying up here. They will not expect us to walk right back under their noses. It was a gamble. A desperate, terrifying gamble. But looking at the gray pallor of his skin, Clara knew they had no choice. Finding the horses took an hour. Banjo and the roan had bolted when the fire started but hadn't gone far, taking shelter in a stand of aspen further down the ravine. Clara coaxed them back with soft words and shaking hands. Getting Elias into the saddle was a brutal ordeal. He could barely stand. Clara had to fashion a crude sling from the stirrup leather and a length of rope she found in the saddlebag, looping it around his torso to keep him upright. "Put your foot in," she ordered, guiding his boot to the stirrup. Elias groaned, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing cold. He hauled himself up, his face turning white as bone. He swayed in the saddle, gripping the horn with white-knuckled force. "Tie me on," he gasped. "If I pass out, do not let me fall." Clara used the rope to lash his waist to the saddle horn. She mounted the roan, grabbing Banjo's reins. "We go slow," she said, "step by step." The descent was a nightmare. The wind picked up as they crossed the open ridges, slicing through Clara's thin dress and the coat she had reclaimed from the pack. The snow sucked at the horses' hooves, balling up in the shoes, forcing them to stumble. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, his head lolled on his chest. He muttered to people who weren't there, "I did not mean it. Silas," he mumbled, his voice thick. "I should have drawn faster. The sun was in my eyes." Clara looked back at him, her heart aching. He was reliving the gunfight. He was carrying the ghost of his friend up and down this mountain every day. "I told him, 'Stay down,'" Elias whispered to the wind. "Red, stay down." Clara realized then that Red Miller wasn't just a ranch hand. He was the man Elias was accused of killing. The wanted poster had said Elias killed him, but Elias was apologizing to him. The guilt he carried was a heavy, living thing. It explained the isolation. It explained the walls he built. He wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from himself. "Hold on." "Elias," Clara called out, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Just a little further." Her hands were numb blocks of ice on the reins. She could not feel her fingers. She watched the horizon, scanning for riders, terrified that every dark shape in the distance was Vance coming back to finish the job. But the mountain was empty. They were alone in the vast, indifferent whiteness. Dusk was bleeding purple across the plains when they reached the outskirts of Red Hollow. The town looked peaceful from a distance, the windows glowing with warm yellow light, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. It looked like a haven. Clara knew it was a trap. She steered the horses off the main road, circling wide through the brush to approach from the south. There was an old barn there, its roof sagging. Abandoned years ago when the creek changed course, she guided the horses inside. The air smelled of dry rot and old hay. Clara slid from the saddle, her legs buckling. She caught herself on the stall door. She untied Elias, her fingers fumbling with the knots. "Elias," she whispered. "We are here. You have to get down." He slid from the saddle more than stepped, collapsing into her arms. They went down together into the straw. Clara checked him. He was burning up with fever now. His breathing was wet. "I have to go get the doctor," she said, brushing the hair from his forehead. "No," Elias croaked, grabbing her wrist. "Too dangerous. Your father, he will not see me. Clara promised. I will be a ghost." She pulled the canvas coat tight around her, pulled the hat low, and slipped out of the barn into the gathering dark. The streets of Red Hollow were muddy slush. Men lingered outside the saloon, their cigarettes glowing like fireflies. Laughter spilled out, loud and raucous. Clara kept to the shadows, walking with her head down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum. She passed two women standing by the mercantile, furious. One was saying, "Holt is tearing strips off everyone. Says the search party came back empty-handed." "And Samuel?" the other asked. "Oh, he is telling everyone she is unwell." the first woman replied, lowering her voice. Says she had a spell. Says she is dangerous to herself. They are painting her as a lunatic. Poor thing. Clara felt a flash of hot anger, but she swallowed it. Let them talk. Let them think she was mad. Mad women were invisible. She reached the small white building with a sign, Doctor. A. Thorne. Physician-surgeon. The windows were dark, but a light burned in the back room. Clara knocked. Once, twice. The door opened. A man stood there, wiping his spectacles. He was middle-aged, with graying mutton chops and eyes that looked like they had seen too much death and not enough sleep. We are closed, he said wearily. Unless you are bleeding or birthing. Come back tomorrow. I need help, Clara whispered. She took off the hat. Doctor. Thorne froze. He stared at her face, then at the wanted poster that he knew was tacked up at the sheriff's office. Miss Holt. He breathed. Clara stepped inside and pushed the door shut, locking it behind her. She stood with her back to the wood, trembling. Please, she said, I have nowhere else to go. Thorne looked at her, at the soot on her face, the desperation in her eyes, the canvas coat that was 3 sizes too big. Your father is looking for you, he said carefully. Garrison Holt has men riding the perimeter. I know, Clara said. I am not going back to them. I would rather you turn me over to the sheriff than to them. Thorne sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was a man of science in a town of brute force. He had stitched up enough of Holt's victims to know the truth behind the power. Who are you with? He asked. You did not survive 3 weeks in the high country alone. Clara hesitated, then lifted her chin. Elias Carr. The doctor's eyebrows shot up. The gunman, the one they say killed Red Miller? He is not a killer, Clara said fiercely. He is hurt. Holt's men. They burned his cabin. They beat him. He has cracked ribs and a fever. He is in the old barn by the creek. Thorne stared at her for a long moment. He saw the fierce loyalty in her face, the way she stood ready to fight him if he refused. He turned and grabbed his black bag. I took an oath, he muttered, more to himself than to her. And I never did like the way Holt looks at a horse, let alone a woman. If you help him, Clara said, I promise we will leave. You will never see us again. I will not bring trouble to your door. Child, Thorne said, opening the back door into the alley. You are the trouble, but lead the way. The barn was freezing. Doctor, Thorne worked by the light of a tin lantern, his hands quick and efficient. He cut away Elias's shirt, revealing the mottled purple and black bruising that spanned his entire rib cage. Nasty, Thorne muttered, probing a spot that made Elias hiss through his teeth. 2 cracked, maybe 1 broken. Lung sounds are clear, though. That is a mercy. He cleaned the cuts on Elias's face with alcohol, stinging the dirt away. Elias lay on the straw, his eyes fixed on Clara, who was holding the lantern, while the doctor worked, wrapping Elias's torso in tight linen bandages. The silence in the barn grew heavy. Why are you helping me? Elias asked the doctor, his voice rasping. You know who I am? I know who they say you are, Thorne corrected. They say I killed Red Miller, Elias said. Thorne paused. Holding a strip of linen? Did you? Elias looked at the roof of the barn. No. He took a breath, wincing at the pain. Holt wanted Red's land. It had the only year-round spring in the lower valley. He sent me and 2 others to persuade him. We were regulators. That was the job. Scare him off. Elias closed his eyes. I told them no shooting. I told them we talk first. But Red, he was scared. He pulled a shotgun. The man beside me, a hired gun named Vance, he didn't wait. He shot Red in the chest. Vance, Clara whispered. The man who burned the cabin. Elias nodded. Red didn't die right away. I tried to stop the bleeding. Vance laughed. He said we should finish him. I turned my gun on Vance. I told him if he pulled that trigger again, I would kill him. He looked at Clara. I held Vance off until Red died. But Holt, he twisted it. He told the sheriff I went rogue, that I was drunk and shot Red over a poker debt. Vance backed him up. I had no witness. It was my word against a cattle baron. So I ran. The barn was silent. Clara looked at Elias. seeing him fully for the first time. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't even a hero. He was a man who had tried to stand in the middle of a landslide and had been crushed by the rocks. "They twisted us both," Clara said softly. "You with a gun, me with a wedding ring. We were just pieces on a board they were playing." Thorn finished the knot. "You should rest," he said, packing his bag. "Do not move unless you have to." Suddenly, the barn door burst open. Light flooded in from the street, blinding them. Silhouettes filled the doorway. "There!" a voice shouted. "I saw the doctor come in. It was Vance." Panic surged through Clara. She scrambled back, dropping the lantern. It rolled into the straw, the flame guttering. "Grab her!" Vance yelled. Men swarmed into the barn. Thorn stood up, blocking them. "This is a medical emergency," he shouted. "You have no right." Vance backhanded the doctor, sending him sprawling into the hay. "Out of the way! Pill pusher!" Two men grabbed Clara. She fought, kicking and scratching, but they were too strong. They dragged her toward the door. Elias tried to rise, a roar of rage tearing from his throat. He reached for his gun belt, but it was out of reach. "No!" he screamed. "Clara!" A boot caught him in the ribs, sending him crashing back down into the agony of his broken bones. "Stay down, dog," a man sneered, kicking him again. Clara was dragged out into the street. The noise had drawn a crowd. People were spilling out of the saloon, out of their houses. "Let me go!" Clara screamed. They dragged her to the center of the muddy street, under the gaslight of the hotel. And there, standing on the boardwalk, was Samuel Holt. He looked immaculate in his suit, his face red with a mixture of relief and fury. Beside him stood Garrison Holt, leaning on a cane, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "Father!" Clara cried, struggling against the men holding her arms. Samuel stepped down into the mud. He walked up to her and slapped her across the face. The sound cracked like a whip through the silent town. "You ungrateful, shameful girl," Samuel hissed. "Look at you, dressed in rags, sleeping in a barn with a murderer." He turned to the crowd, spreading his hands. "My daughter is unwell. She has been taken advantage of." "Liar!" Clara screamed. She wrenched one arm free, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You sold me! You sold me to him to pay your debts!" A ripple of shock went through the crowd. She turned to Garrison Holt. "And you tried to force yourself on me in my father's study. You choked me. You said you would break me." Her voice was raw, hysterical, but it carried to every corner of the street. It sliced through the gossip and the lies. Some of the townspeople looked away, embarrassed, but others, the women, the shopkeepers who had been bullied by Holt's men, looked at her with wide, horrified eyes. The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. It was the crack of a facade breaking. Samuel was trembling. "Take her inside," he sputtered. "Get her out of sight." Holt stepped forward, his face a mask of icy rage. "Lock her in my house." He ordered the men, "In the guest room. Bar the windows." He looked at the crowd, daring anyone to speak. "We will have the wedding tomorrow, noon, to restore decency to this town." "No!" Clara screamed as they dragged her away. "I will not! I will never!" Elias, dragging himself to the barn door, heard her screams fading as they hauled her up the hill toward the brick house. He heard the order. Tomorrow, noon, he lay in the straw, breathing hard, the pain in his ribs a white-hot fire. He looked at the doctor, who was wiping blood from his lip. "Did you hear them?" Elias rasped. Thorn nodded, looking at Elias with a grim expression. "I heard." Elias reached out, his hand shaking, and grabbed his gun belt from the straw. He buckled it on, his fingers clumsy but determined. "Help me up," he said. "You cannot stand." Thorn said, "You will die." "Help me up," Elias roared, tears of rage mixing with the blood on his face. He hauled himself to his feet. Swaying, he checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 rounds. There was never really a choice. He could stay hidden, ride out when he recovered, and live a long, empty life. Or he could walk back into the line of fire for the woman who had pulled him out of the snow. Elias' car limped toward the door, his eyes fixed on the brick house on the hill. "I am coming. Clara," he whispered. The moon hung high and cold over Red Hollow, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow-packed streets. The town was asleep, or pretending to be, behind the frosted glass of the saloon. The lamps had dimmed, and the last of the drunks had stumbled home, leaving the silence to the wind and the stray dogs. In the abandoned barn on the edge of town, the darkness was thick with the smell of old straw and pain. Elias Carr gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. The movement sent a jagged spike of fire through his side where his ribs ground against one another. He stifled a groan, leaning heavily against the rough wood of the stall. The linen bandages, Doctor. Thorn had wrapped around him felt like a corset of iron, tight and restrictive, but they held him together. He could not stay here. Every minute he wasted lying in the dirt was a minute Clara spent trapped in the fortress on the hill. He moved to the door, stepping carefully. He moved not like a rancher, but like the regulator he had once been, a man who knew how to walk through dry leaves without snapping a twig. He slipped out into the alley, pulling the collar of his coat up to hide his face. The air was biting, sharp enough to freeze the moisture in his nose, but the cold was good. It numbed the throbbing in his face where the boot had caught him. He moved like a ghost through the back streets. He avoided the main thoroughfare, sticking to the narrow gaps between the false front buildings, stepping over frozen puddles and piles of refuse. He paused at the corner of the livery, watching the sheriff's office. The lights were out. The law in this town slept soundly, comfortable in the pocket of rich men. Elias looked up toward the hill. The Holt mansion loomed there, a dark square against the stars. A single light burned in an upstairs window. "Hold on, Clara," he whispered to the freezing air. "Just hold on until morning," inside the guest room of the brick house. Clara Holt sat on the edge of a four-poster bed that felt less like furniture and more like a scaffold. The room was luxurious, filled with mahogany and velvet, but the door was locked from the outside, and the heavy drapes were drawn tight against the night. She could hear the house settling around her. Somewhere downstairs. A clock chimed the hour. 2 in the morning. Earlier. She had heard the servants in the hallway. They had not whispered quietly enough. "She is ruining everything," a maid had muttered. "The master is in a rage. He says if she does not go through with it tomorrow, he will turn her out on the street without a penny. She should be grateful." Another voice had replied, "Mr. Holt is a catch. Most girls would kill to be in her shoes." Clara stared at the wall, her eyes dry and burning. They did not understand. To them, she was a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. They did not know what it was to look into the eyes of a man who saw you as livestock. The lock clicked. Clara stiffened, her hands gripping the silk bedspread. The door opened, and Garrison Holt stepped inside. He carried a lamp, the light casting deep shadows into the hollows of his face. He was still using a cane, favoring the leg he had injured years ago, a weakness he usually tried to hide. Tonight, he looked formidable, dressed in a smoking jacket, his hair slicked back. He did not close the door. He stood there, looking at her with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "You are still awake," he observed, his voice smooth as oil. "I cannot sleep in a prison," Clara said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Holt chuckled softly, stepping into the room and placing the lamp on the bureau. "You have a flair for the dramatic, my dear. That is what got you into this mess. Running off into the mountains, sleeping in filth, screaming like a fishwife in the middle of the street." He walked toward her, the cane tapping rhythmically on the floorboards. "You embarrassed your father today. Clara, you embarrassed me. I told the truth." Clara said. Holt stopped a foot away from her. He loomed over her, smelling of brandy and expensive tobacco. "Truth is what people agree to believe," he said softly. "And by tomorrow noon, after we are wed, everyone will agree that you were simply unwell, a temporary hysteria brought on by the stress of the engagement." "I will not marry you," Clara whispered. Holt's expression hardened. He reached out, his hand moving so fast she flinched. He grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her skin. forcing her to look up at him. "You will," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You will marry me, Clara, and you will smile, and you will be the dutiful wife I paid for. Because if you do not, I will make sure your father is ruined. I will call in every debt. I will see him in the poorhouse." He leaned closer, his eyes cold and dead. "And as for your mountain man, if he is not dead already, he will be soon enough. The winter is hard on cripples." Clara felt a numb terror wash over her, cold as the snow outside, but beneath it, deep in the scorched earth of her spirit, a spark flared. It was the same spark that had kept her alive under the floorboards of the burning cabin. It was the anger of a woman who had tasted freedom, however brief, and refused to spit it out. "Get out," she said. Holt smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. He let go of her chin, wiping his hand on his jacket as if she were dirty. "Sleep well, my bride. Tomorrow is a big day." He took the lamp and left, the lock clicking shut behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. Clara sat in the dark. She did not cry. She went to the window and pulled back the heavy drapes. She looked out at the cold, indifferent stars. She thought of Elias. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the alley, not as a possession, but as a partner. She touched the glass, her breath fogging the pain. "I am not afraid," she told herself, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I chose him, and I will choose him again." The morning of the wedding dawned bright and brittle. The sky was a hard, pale blue, bleached of all warmth. The sun offered no heat, only a blinding glare that bounced off the snowdrifts piled against the boardwalks. The bells of the church began to ring at 11, a mournful, clanging sound that echoed through the valley. The town gathered. They came not out of celebration, but out of a morbid curiosity mixed with fear. The pews filled with shopkeepers, ranch hands, and wives who whispered behind gloved hands. They wanted to see the runaway bride. They wanted to see if Garrison Holt could truly tame the girl who had screamed the truth in the street. The air inside the church smelled of damp wood, wool coats, and stale incense. It was cold. Their breath misted in the air as they waited. At 5 minutes to noon, the doors opened. Samuel Holt walked in, looking pale and sweaty. He gripped Clara's arm with a force that turned his knuckles white. Clara walked beside him. She was not wearing the silk gown her father had bought for her. That dress had been ruined in the mud the night before. She wore a plain gray dress, one she had worn for church services for years. It was severe and simple, and in it she looked small but unbreakable. She kept her head high. She looked straight ahead, refusing to meet the eyes of the people who had watched her be dragged through the mud. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup, but her eyes were dry and steady. They reached the front of the church. Garrison Holt stood there, flanked by his best man, the sheriff. Holt wore a black suit that cost more than most men in the room earned in a decade. He watched Clara approach with a look of smug ownership. Samuel practically shoved Clara into place beside Holt. She stumbled slightly, then righted herself, pulling her arm away from her father with a sharp jerk. The preacher, a nervous man with a thin neck, cleared his throat. He opened his Bible, his hands shaking slightly. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice wavering, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The church was silent, save for the shuffling of feet and the cough of a child in the back row. If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now, or else hereafter forever hold their peace. The preacher paused, as was the custom, though he clearly expected silence. He took a breath to continue. The double doors at the back of the church slammed open with a sound like a gunshot. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Elias Carr stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who had walked out of a grave. His face was a map of bruises, purple and yellow blooming across his jaw and eye. He was leaning heavily on the doorframe, breathing hard, but he stood upright. He held his battered hat in his hand. His coat was stained with dried blood and mud, but his eyes were burning, They swept the room, silencing the murmurs, before locking onto Garrison Holt. "I object," Elias said. His voice was rough, scraping against the silence, but it carried to the rafters. He limped forward, step by agonizing step, down the center aisle. The townspeople shrank back, pulling their coats tight, making way for the man they had been told was a monster. "This marriage cannot go forward," Elias said, not stopping until he was 10 feet from the altar. Holt's face turned the color of a brick. "Sheriff," he barked, "arrest this man. He is a fugitive." The sheriff stepped forward, hand on his gun, but Elias did not look at him. He looked at Clara. He looked at her plain gray dress and her terrified, hopeful eyes. He saw the bruise on her arm where her father had grabbed her. "She is not here because she loves you." "Holt," Elias said, turning his gaze to the cattle baron. "She is here because her father sold her to cover a gambling debt, and she is here because you threatened to ruin them if she said no." "Lies!" Samuel Holt shouted, stepping forward, his voice shrill. "The man is a lunatic. Get him out of here. Tell them about the cabin," Elias roared, drowning him out. "Tell them how your men dragged me out into the snow and burned my home to the ground while she was hiding under the floorboards." A shockwave went through the room. People exchanged glances. Arson was a different beast than a runaway bride. "Tell them how you cornered her in your study," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet. "How you put your hands on her throat. That is enough," Holt shouted. Men from the front rows, Holt's hired hands, jumped up, reaching for the pistols tucked into their waistbands. "Stop!" the preacher screamed, holding up his Bible like a shield. "There will be no shooting in the house of God. Take it outside. If you must have blood, take it to the street." The tension in the room broke. The congregation surged toward the doors, desperate to escape the line of fire. Holt gestured to his men. "Outside," he snarled. The confrontation spilled out onto the wooden steps and into the snowy street. The blinding sun illuminated everything with a harsh, unforgiving clarity. Elias backed down the steps, moving into the open space of the road. Holt, Samuel, and 4 of Holt's men followed him, fanning out like a pack of wolves. Clara broke free from her father's grasp and ran down the steps. She did not run away. She ran to Elias. She stood just behind his right shoulder, her hands clenched in the fabric of her skirt, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Get behind me," Elias murmured, shifting his weight to shield her. "I am exactly where I belong," she answered, her voice trembling but fierce. Holt stood on the bottom step, looking down at them. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Look at you," he sneered, "a broken-down gunman and a ruined woman. You are pathetic. Carr, you have nothing, no land, no name, no future. I have the truth," Elias said. "Truth," Holt spat. "I own this town. I own the law. I own the bank that holds the deed to your father's house. Clara, that is the only truth that matters in this world. Power." Elias shook his head slowly. "If justice existed here, you would be in irons. Holt and Samuel would be stripped of his reputation. But you are right. You bought the law. So I guess we have to settle this the old way." He let his coat fall open, revealing the Colt on his hip. Holt's eyes narrowed. "Kill him," he ordered his men. Guns were drawn. The metallic click-clack of hammers cocking echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. But before a shot could be fired, a voice rang out from the boardwalk. "Hold it!" A young man stepped out from the crowd. It was Deputy Finch, the young lawman with the fresh face who had always looked at the ground when Holt walked by. Today, he was looking up. "Deputy, get back in line," the sheriff barked from the church steps. "No," Finch said, his voice shaking but gaining strength. "I was there. Sheriff, I saw the men come back smelling of smoke. I heard them bragging about the fire." He stepped down into the street, drawing his own weapon, not aiming at Elias, but leveling it vaguely toward Holt's men. "I took a badge to keep the peace, not to help rich men hunt women. And I—" came another voice. "Doctor." Thorne pushed through the crowd, carrying his black bag. He walked over and stood next to Elias. He did not have a gun, but he had a glare that could cut glass. "I treated this man's wounds last night," Thorne announced to the crowd. "Cracked ribs, beaten half to death. And I saw the bruises on the girl weeks ago. This is not a marriage. It is a hostage situation." The crowd began to murmur. The silence that had held Red Hollow in a chokehold for years began to fracture. A shopkeeper nodded. A rancher spat on the ground and glared at Holt. Holt saw the tide turning. He saw his control slipping away like water through fingers. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "Kill them all," he screamed. The street erupted. It wasn't a duel. It was a brawl. Holt's men opened fire. Elias shoved Clara down behind a water trough and returned fire. His movements practiced and deadly despite his injuries. Bang! Bang! A bullet kicked up snow inches from Elias's boot. He fired back, hitting one of Holt's men in the shoulder, spinning him around. Deputy Finch fired, his shot going wild, but it forced two of the hired hands to duck behind a wagon. A shot rang out from the church steps. The sheriff, firing at his own deputy? The bullet hit Finch in the leg. The young man cried out and collapsed into the snow, clutching his thigh. That was the breaking point. Seeing the young deputy shot by his own boss galvanized the town. Two ranchers pulled pistols from their coats. "That is enough," one shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. "Drop them!" Holt's men hesitated. They looked at the angry faces of the townspeople, their neighbors, their customers. They looked at the bleeding deputy. They lowered their guns. They were hired to bully, not to fight a war against a whole town. Holt stood alone on the steps, his chest heaving. He looked at his men, who were backing away. He looked at Samuel, who was cowering behind a pillar. "Cowards!" Holt screamed. He looked at Elias, who was standing in the street, gun lowered but ready. "You," Holt hissed, "you took everything from me." He reached inside his jacket. He pulled out a small, pearl-handled revolver. Elias raised his gun, but he didn't fire. He saw the madness in Holt's eyes. Holt lunged down the stairs, not firing, but charging, overwhelmed by a blind, impotent rage. He slipped on a patch of ice near the bottom step. His arms flailed. The heavy cane flew from his hand. He crashed onto the frozen ground. Hard. Bang! The small revolver in his hand went off as he hit the earth. The sound was muffled by his own body. Holt jerked once, then went still. He lay face down in the snow, a dark stain spreading slowly from beneath his chest. The silence that followed was absolute. Samuel Holt stared at the body of the man who was supposed to save him. He began to back away, his hands trembling. "It was not me," Samuel stammered. "I had nothing to do with it." The sheriff looked at the dead man, then at the crowd. He slowly holstered his gun. He walked over to Samuel Holt. "Samuel Holt," the sheriff said, his voice flat, "you are under arrest for assault and coercion, and I reckon the judge will want to hear about that gambling debt, too." He grabbed Samuel's arm, the same arm that had bruised Clara, and marched him away. Elias stood in the street, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He holstered his gun. He turned to the water trough. "Clara?" She stood up, brushing the snow from her skirt. She was shaking, but she was unharmed. She looked at him, then she ran. She collided with him, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his coat. Elias wrapped his arms around her, wincing at the pain in his ribs, but holding her as if he would never let go. In the quiet aftermath, the adrenaline faded, leaving behind only the cold and the exhaustion. Clara knelt in the snow beside Deputy Finch. "Doctor." Thorne was already there, cutting away the pant leg to inspect the wound. It went clean through. Thorne said, "He will keep the leg." Clara took the young man's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us." Finch gritted his teeth, managing a pale smile. I got tired of looking down. Miss Holt." Elias stood nearby, watching her. He saw the way she comforted the boy. He saw the way the townspeople looked at her now, not with judgment, but with a quiet, shamed respect. She had broken the spell. The preacher, who had been hovering by the church doors, walked down the steps. He looked at the dead body of Holt being carried away, then at Clara and Elias. "Miss Holt," the preacher said awkwardly, clutching his hat, The ceremony was interrupted, but if you wish, your father is in jail, but—" He trailed off, looking at Elias. Clara stood up. She walked over to Elias and took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. "I will not marry anyone today," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of iron. "I will not marry to fix a reputation. I will not marry to erase shame." She looked up at Elias, her eyes clear and full of light. "If I marry, preacher, it will be because I choose love, not fear. And right now, we have a home to build." Weeks passed. The winter, having done its worst, began to loosen its grip on the high country. The sun lingered a little longer each day, eating away at the edges of the drifts. Elias and Clara returned to the mountain. The site of the cabin was a scar on the landscape. The blackened chimney stood like a tombstone among the ashes. Charred beams jutted up like broken bones against the bright blue sky. "It feels like a grave," Clara said, kicking a piece of burnt wood with her boot. "It is," Elias said, unloading the tools from the pack horse. "We are burying the past here." They began to work. It was brutal labor. They hauled fresh logs from the timberline, their breath steaming in the air. They stripped bark until their hands were blistered and raw. They mixed mud for chinking, working side by side, their shoulders aching in unison. But they were not always alone. People came from town. First, it was Dr. Thorne, bringing supplies and a strong back for a weekend. Then, it was Deputy Finch, hobbling on a cane, bringing a sack of nails. Even the shopkeeper who had sold Elias the flour rode up one Sunday with his son to help lift the heavy ridgepole. They did not say much. They worked quietly, driven by a need to make amends for the silence they had kept while a monster ruled their town. They were rebuilding their own consciences as much as the cabin. As spring began to spread green fire across the valleys, pushing wildflowers through the ash and char, the new cabin took shape. It was larger than the old one. It had a second room, a small one, for storage or perhaps a child one day. It had a sturdy door made of oak and a bed frame Elias built with his own hands, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk. The partnership in work mirrored the trust that was healing their old wounds. Elias learned to laugh again, a rusty sound that grew easier with practice. Clara learned that she was strong, that her hands could build as well as mend. One evening, the last beam was set. The roof was tight. The stove was installed and drawing well. The sky turned a soft, dusty rose over the distant peaks, painting the world in gentle light. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Elias. "It is done," she said. Elias looked at the cabin. It was solid. It was safe. It was home. Clara took his hand and led him inside. The room smelled of fresh pine sap and sawdust, a clean, sharp scent of new beginnings. The bed was made with a new quilt Clara had sewn, patched together from scraps but warm and bright. For the first time, there was no fear pressing in on the walls, no ghosts in the corners. Clara climbed onto the bed. She patted the space beside her. "Come here," she said, a small, tremulous smile touching her lips. Elias sat down. He looked at her, at the soot on her cheek, the calluses on her fingers, the love in her dark eyes. "This is ours," she whispered. No stolen nights, no hiding in the dark, no shame. She reached out and touched his face, tracing the scar that had faded but would never disappear. Elias lay down. He pulled her to him, and she fit herself against his body, the way she had that first night when she was just a desperate girl breaking into a stranger's life. But this time, she did not cling to him out of terror. She held him with strength. Her eyes were clear, full of choice. Elias leaned in and kissed her. It was a long, unhurried kiss. It tasted of everything they had survived, the ash and the snow, the blood on the street, the gossip and the quiet tenderness that had grown like a flower in the rock. Desire was still there, deep and intense, humming in the blood. But it was no longer a frantic thing. It was woven with respect. It was unshakable. Night fell over the mountain. The fire in the new hearth crackled softly, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Outside, the Wild West remained harsh and unforgiving, a land of predators and storms. But inside, Elias and Clara lay together, her head on his chest, his arm draped protectively over her. They listened to the distant, lonely howl of the coyotes, and they smiled into the dark. They had carved out a fragile, fierce peace on this scorched land, and it belonged to them, equally and forever. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Elias and Clara through the storms and struggles of the American West. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of love, survival, and the frontier. I look forward to reading your thoughts and comments in English. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.